Hello everybody and welcome back to another tech tree overview. And in today's tech tree overview I'm going to go over both the US and IJN carriers. And the reason I'm going to go and do these two carrier lines together is because as a carrier you have mirror matchmaking, which means you'll always run into another carrier. So why not? First up at tier 4 you have the Langley on the US side and the Hosho on the Japanese side. I think at this particular tier the US carrier is the better of the two. You have a flight control module on the US carrier that gives it a 1-1-1, which means it's got one torpedo bomber, one dive bomber, and one fighter. The Hosho has a 1-2. It's got one fighter and two torpedo bombers. Now, the US squadrons have more aircraft. There's 6 torpedo bombers, 6 dive bombers, and that's going to give them a superior punch when compared to the Hosho. Furthermore, the US carriers are going to be able to DOT better than the Japanese ones. So you can do more fires and flooding, because the Japanese one can only do flooding and no fires. In terms of the actual aircraft themselves, the Langley has slightly inferior fighters when compared to the Hosho. However, there's more of them, so it doesn't really matter. In terms of torpedo bombers, the Langley's torpedo bombers are a touch bit slower, going 97 knots compared to 115, and they do a touch less damage, 8,500 versus 8,567 on the Hoshos. However, the Langley, like I mentioned earlier, has dive bombers, and the Hosho has nothing in kind. Also, the Langley has more aircraft in total, having 30 aircraft in its hangar as a total, and the Hosho only has 24. Where the Langley is not as good is when it comes to the ship itself. The Langley is a tractor on water. It doesn't go anywhere fast, ever. Its max speed of 15 knots makes you feel like that a snail on water is going to pass you by faster. The Hosho at least has speed on its side. If it gets into a little bit of trouble, the Hosho can at least run away at 25 knots. You're at least going somewhere at a decent speed. In terms of spotting, the Langley is also less stealthy, having a surface detectability range of 10.1 compared to only 8.8 on the Hosho. In terms of secondary armament and AA, they're pretty similar. I mean, I think the Hosho has a small edge when it comes to AA, but you're talking about this tier where AA is kind of minimal and secondary guns aren't really, there's not that many of them, and they really can't deal with anything up close. So, in case a destroyer gets up close, you're going to be in trouble anyways. Still, when it comes to the raw performance of how the aircraft are going to perform, I would say the edge at tier 4 definitely goes to the US, and that the Langley is the better carrier. However, the US doesn't really get to enjoy its superiority for very long, because the minute you get to tier 5, the balance begins to swing away from the US, and it does so for the next couple of tiers. At tier 5 you've got the Bogue on the US side, and you have the Zuiho on the Japanese side. And the Bogue is a worse Langley, and can best be described as sort of Tractor 2.0, but without the Langley's flexibility. The Bogue comes with 3 flight control modules, a 110, a 201, or a 012. Now, in terms of the aircraft that the Bogue carries, they are similar to what the Japanese Zuiho would carry. The fighter's a little bit slower, the torpedo bomber a little bit slower, but the dive bomber is a little bit faster. If you carry torpedo bombers, the torpedo bombers do more damage, 9,867 damage per torp compared to 8,567. And the dive bombers are definitely going to be superior, doing 7,500 damage versus 4,600. But the Bogue's flight control, however, does make it more of a ship that, you go into a battle doing one thing in mind. So if you go in, the 110 is not really competitive, especially when you compare it to the Zuiho's 112 or 121. If you decide to go in with a 110, the Zuiho is in pretty much any of its flight control modules gonna pretty much beat you up. let's just put it out there. The Zuiho is just gonna have more squadrons, and it's gonna be able to do more. If you choose to go 201 as an air superiority, you can shut down the Japanese carriers. However, your striking power is pretty dismal, and in the event you need to strike something, you really can't. If you decide to go full strike, you're going to do a little bit more damage than the Japanese carriers, potentially, although you have no fighters at all. So Japanese carrier has the extra fighter, is going to be able to bully you around. In terms of plane capacity, the Zuiho has 2 extra planes, having 30 units in total, compared to 28 on the Bogue. Where the Zuiho really outshines the Bogue is the speed. The Zuiho goes 28 knots, the Bogue goes at a pretty stationary 16.5. It's a little bit faster than the Langley, but it's still a tractor on water. In terms of the detectability, the Bogue is at a pretty dismal 11.9, while the Zuiho has 9.2 kilometer surface detect. Once again, in terms of AA, the Zuiho is a little bit better, namely because of the changes to AA, giving the larger caliber AA more damage. So AA edge goes to the Zuiho. Zuiho also has a little bit better and more viable secondaries in case it needs them. Starting at tier 5, you're going to see this trend where the Japanese carriers are going to consistently be the more flexible, more adaptable carriers, while the US are more specialists in their one specific role. At tier 6, you get to the Independence. The Independence is finally going to allow you to do one thing, which is actually, have your ships sail around a bit more. The Independence is faster than the Bogue, which is a nice change. However, the same problems present themselves. The Independence has a 111 stock. Flight control module has a 201 air superiority configuration, and it's got a 012 strike configuration. In terms of aircraft, at this particular tier, the Independence fighter is a little bit better than the Japanese fighter. It's a bit faster, a little bit more durable, does a little bit more damage. Torpedo bombers, a little bit slower, but does more damage. Dive bombers, faster, does more damage. So in terms of the individual planes themselves, the Independence has mostly better aircraft. However, in terms of the amount of planes it can carry, it has less than the Ryujo. The Ryujo has 48, the Independence has 37. But what makes the Ryujo a better carrier is the fact that its flight control modules allow it to do more things. It's got a 112 stock flight control module, which is kind of meh, but it's got an air superiority 311, which even though, it's an air superiority configuration, it still has a torpedo bomber and a dive bomber, giving it more striking potential than the single dive bomber squadron that the US gets. It also has one extra fighter squadron, which is very, very useful. Also, when it goes full strike on the Ryujo, it's a 122. Again, 2 torpedo bomber squadrons and 2 dive bomber squadrons is better than having 1 torpedo bomber squadron and 2 dive bombers with no fighters, because the Ryujo actually has an extra fighter. Again, more flexible, more adaptable to situations. Other than that, in terms of secondaries, the Ryujo is better. It actually has secondaries, and thus its AA is a touch bit better. Again, that's because the Independence has only 40mm and 20mm AA guns. So, edge in terms of AA secondaries to the Ryujo. Independence is a touch bit faster, 31.5 knots. The Ryujo goes 28. Surface detectability pretty close, 10.3 on the Independence, 9.9 on the Ryujo. Tier 7 maintains kind of the same trends. You have a 111 stock, a 202 with the Ranger in its air superiority configuration, or 013 in its strike. Comparatively speaking, the Hiryu, much more flexible, much more adaptable, has a 122, a 312, or 222. In terms of aircraft, the US fighters are a touch bit faster, they are a little bit more durable. Their torpedo bombers are a bit faster, does more damage. Dive bombers a teeny bit slower, but does more damage. So again, the US in terms of aircraft have better aircraft, but way less squadrons, which is a huge difference, because if your one fighter squadron is superior, in the event you run up against an air superiority Hiryu who's running, let's say, 3 fighter squadrons, and you're only running 1, you might struggle. Even if you run 2, you might struggle if the Hiryu pulls off a couple of good strafes. So there is that element of the USCVs that it's like, you're good at one role, and that's pretty much it. That's the one thing you can do, because otherwise you're just not going to have as good of a package as what the Hiryu has. Because if you go a superiority on a Ranger, sure, you have 2 fighter squadrons which are stronger than the Hiryu's 3, but Hiryu has a torpedo bomber squadron and has 2 dive bombers, which means it can DOT way more efficiently than you can in a Ranger. You go all strike, well, if a Hiryu goes, its balanced 222 configuration, it's going to kick you around. Furthermore, the stock Ranger is worse than the Hiryu stock, because the stock Ranger only has 58 aircraft, the Hiryu has 72 stock. So if you're in a stock Ranger, you're going to suffer there. Performance-wise, for the ship, the Hiryu's secondaries are a little bit better than the Rangers. Its A is pretty comparable. In terms of its speed, it's faster, 34 knots. The Ranger goes 29.5, and again, the Ranger is more easy to spot. If you're playing the Ranger in its dedicated role, either all air superiority or it's all pure strike, it can do that job really well. But again, you run into a Hiryu, the Hiryu just adapts to the situation better, and you're going to be in trouble. Up to about tier 7, I think the Japanese has an edge. From 5 to 7, the Japanese have an edge, assuming you have competent captains playing both ships. I think the Japanese have an edge. However, once you get up to tier 8, that's where things start to get a little interesting. The Lexington has, on paper, it looks identical to what the Ranger has. It has a 111, a 202, or a 013. However, the big change that happens here is to the dive bombers. While the fighters are pretty comparable in terms of speed and everything, the Japanese having a slight edge, then the Japanese having a slight edge in torpedo bombers. When it comes to dive bombers, even though the Japanese will have faster planes from tier 8 to tier 10, the damage difference is huge, as the Lexington's dive bombers get 1,000-pound bombs that do 10,800 damage, which is way more than the 4,600 done by the Shokaku. While the flight control module looks very, very similar to what the Ranger has, the 202 on the Lexington actually packs a decent punch compared to the 202 on the Ranger. The 2 dive bombers on the Ranger with the 500-pound bombs, they're kind of very meh, but the Lexi's 2 dive bombers can actually put a hurt on stuff. And if you go with all strike Lexi, it's a very, very scary thing having to face down 3 dive bomber squadrons that can hit you for a good chunk of damage. The Shokaku, again, is still more flexible. I mean, if you're running a 222 Shokaku and you run into 013, you're going to be able to bully the Lexington's planes with those 2 fighters while maintaining a pretty good strike package. If you run air superiority and you run into a Lexington's air superiority, you still have that extra torpedo bomber to play with. So in that sense, the Shokaku, again, more flexible, although the Lexington in its dedicated role, doing one thing, is pretty decent. In terms of aircraft carrying capacity, they're both the same, 72 aircraft. Speed, they're all pretty similar. Shokaku 34 knots, Lexington 33. Lexington's edge has definitely on anti-aircraft. Lexington has way better AA. As a Shokaku, you're going to find that if you're going to attack a Lexington, you're going to lose planes. Well, it's not true the other way around. The Lexington, however, is a huge target. Spotting range 17.5 kilometers, huge shoot me sign. While the Shokaku is a pretty stealthy 12.4. This allows the Shokaku to get a little bit closer to front lines, while the Lexington cannot get into that kind of area because it will get shot at. So all in all, tier 8 is where I think things start to kind of balance out a little bit better, where the US has its advantages and the Japanese have their own advantages. It just depends on what you prefer. Once you get past tier 8, so once you get past the Lexington and the Shokaku, once you move up to tier 9 and tier 10, that's where I think things get pretty interesting. And tier 9, I think, out of all the CV tiers, I think tier 9 is where CVs are best balanced. So if you take a look at the Essex and the Taiho, this is where these 2 nations carriers are probably most similar. First up, if you look at the individual performance of the aircraft, the Essex fighters are a little bit faster, but they do a little bit less damage, also a little bit more durable. The torpedo bombers and dive bombers on the Essex are slower than the Taihos, but they do a little bit more damage, and at least on the dive bombers have a little bit better durability. So the individual planes themselves, pretty similar in terms of performance. The Essex, however, has again more specialized loadouts. It's either got a balance 211, air superiority 302, or strike 113. Comparatively speaking, the Taiho has a balance 222. It has an air superiority 322 or a strike 232. The air superiority on the Taiho is better in the sense that it maintains some striking potential for slightly worse aircraft performance. And when it comes to its strike, it's got a little bit better air for a strike package that's a little bit worse than the Essex. And the sort of stock setup on the Taiho, well, nobody really talks too much about that one because there are definitely better alternatives once you upgrade. The Essex, however, does have a balanced setup, the 211, But with the US CVs, I would just recommend picking the specialist role that you want to do and just go with it and just pick the specialist. Don't be the sort of balanced one, because the Taiho is going to be able to outdo you there. Everything else on the aircraft carriers are pretty similar. AA is similar. The Taiho is 0.5 knots faster. HP is similar. Secondaries are similar. Even detectability is pretty similar. The only advantage the Taiho has over the Essex, the armor on the ship is actually better than the Essex. Other than that, they're very, very similar. And finally, you get up to Tier 10. And Tier 10 is where I think things are pretty interesting. Both carriers are now armored carriers, so they're all pretty hard to kill off on the first strike, the Midway being hard to kill off because it has more HP. The aircraft performance is interesting. The American strike aircraft hit harder, but the Japanese strike aircraft are quite a bit faster. Fighter performance is pretty comparable. The flight control module, however, is where things get interesting. The Midway, unlike the Essex, actually has a pretty viable balanced setup because it's got a 2-1-2, and again, 2 dive bomber squadrons with the new 1,000-pound bombs, they can do quite a bit of damage. So the 2-1-2 is actually quite viable. The 302 is viable if you want to establish air supremacy by sacrificing a bit of hitting power, and the 113 is still going to pack a pretty big punch. The Hakuryu's advantage lies in the fact that it just has simply more squadrons than the Midway does, and a good Hakuryu captain is going to make life very difficult for a good Midway captain. The Hakuryu, nobody really uses the stock one if they can help it, because as soon as they can upgrade, they'll move to the upgraded ones, has a 422 air superiority or 233 strike. The 422 air superiority can shut down any Midway setup will maintain a still competent strike package of 2 torpedo bombers and 2 dive bombers. If the Hakuryu goes strike, its 2 fighters can keep the Midway fighters busy, and 3 torpedo bomber squadrons are no slouch when it comes to doing damage, coupled with 3 additional dive bomber squadrons for DOT. So the Hakuryu, if captained by a good player, is going to pretty much in most cases overwhelm a Midway, as you're able to either outstrike the Midway or outfighter the Midway. So in addition to that alone, the Hakuryu's extra squadrons also allows it to help the team better by scouting more. So there's another edge the Hakuryu has that the Midway doesn't. But things aren't exactly hopeless for the Midway, because the Midway does have 136 aircraft, the most of any carrier right now in the game. The Hakuryu has 100, which means that the Midway can take losses a little bit better, which means that you can probably be okay with sacrificing aircraft on a Midway, but not so much on a Hakuryu. Everything else about these two carriers are reasonably comparable. The Hakuryu has slightly better secondaries. The Midway, I think, and the Hakuryu in terms of AA are pretty comparable. Hakuryu is a little bit faster, going 34.5 knots compared to the Midway's 33. The Midway is easier to spot, 18.4 versus the Hakuryu's 15.7. The Hakuryu has slightly better deck armor, while the Midway has slightly more armor on its citadels, and it's got that extra chunk of HP, which does make it difficult for a Hakuryu to one-shot a Midway. On the flip side, the Midway is more easily able to take out a Hakuryu in one go, assuming the captain who's playing the Midway is actually competent and knows how to use damage over time to his advantage. Overall, though, both the Tier 10 carriers, I think, are pretty competitive. Although, for me personally, when I look at the two carriers, I think that the Hakuryu's number of squadrons, the fact that it has more, in the right hands, is going to be able to shut down a Midway, while the Midway is going to find it harder to shut down a Hakuryu. All in all, though, the US CV line, after all the changes and everything, once they've given the US 1,000-pound bombs, is a viable CV line to play still. So if you're on the US CV line now, don't give up hope. There are good ships at the end there. If you're on the Japanese line, keep playing for sure, because the Japanese CV line is a really solid one. You just have to work on the micro aspect of playing CVs. In terms of the flexibility, the edge definitely goes to Japanese CVs. The American CVs, pretty much up until almost the very end, are rather inflexible, and they're better at the one role that you thought for at the beginning, you know, in the port. Now, I'm going to go strike, or I'm going to go fighter. Once you pick that role, that's what you're going to be able to do, but you can't really adapt. Japanese CVs are definitely more adaptable. Other than that, I mean, in the mid tiers, when the Americans have that disadvantage when it comes to the flexibility and the squadrons and everything, their aircraft are a little bit better. Although by the end game, the Japanese bombers and everything are a touch bit faster, which helps them, especially because they don't have as many aircraft, and being a little bit faster allows them to get back and cycle a bit faster. The one other thing, of course, that I didn't really talk about is that American squadrons having 6 aircraft, and if you have air supremacy for fighters and dive bombers 7 aircraft, do have longer servicing time, something that the Japanese CVs have that advantage of, that the aircraft are able to rearm and cycle faster. However, the Japanese CVs do have more aircraft that they need to land and take off, so sometimes the advantage isn't as big. Still, in certain circumstances, it is definitely there. And that's pretty much an overview of the Japanese and American carrier lines. They're both playable, although if you prefer flexibility, I would recommend going down the IJN. If you're willing to be more specialist and focus on one task, then I think the US CVs you can still play, and they're still pretty competitive at the end tiers. Anyways, folks, I hopefully have answered your questions about the carriers between the two nations and which one you should go down and what their pros and cons are. If you have any questions, do leave those in the comment section below, and I'll try my best to answer them. Aside from all that, I hope you all have a good one, and I'll talk to all of you again soon.